Ivan the Terrible witnessed his pregnant daughter-in-law wearing clothing he deemed inappropriate. He proceeded to live up to his name in an absolutely brutal manner. Ivan the Terrible was nothing like his father, Grand Prince Vasilis III, who, compared to his son, was downright tame. Yet Vasilis's reign wasn't without scandal, especially when it came to producing an heir. After 2 decades of childless marriage, he and his first wife turned to desperate and dubious measures, but in the end she remained barren. Under pressure from the Boyas, Vasilis cast her aside and married the much younger Elena Glenskaya, an unpopular choice that would have lasting consequences. Even then, years passed without a child, until finally, in 1530, Vasilis's salvation arrived in the form of a son. He named the boy Ivan. It was only after that boy grew into a man that he earned the rest of his name. Ivan IV was just 3 years old when his father suddenly succumbed to a fatal infection. Not exactly Grand Prince material. So, while he grew up, his mother Elena effectively became the ruler of Russia. The Boyas likely assumed that with the princess on the throne, they would be free to run amok and do as they wished. But if they didn't know what kind of woman Elena Glenskaya was yet, they were about to learn the hard way. As soon as her husband was in the ground, Princess Elena set about strengthening her hold on Russia until her son came of age. Though she did everything in her power to ensure that her son Ivan could take Russia's throne, Princess Elena never lived to see it. She died suddenly in 1538 at just 28 years old. Ivan was still technically ruler of Russia, but at just 8 years old, he wasn't all that terrible yet. After Elena's death, all of the most prominent Boya families began vying for control of the country. In all of their backstabbing and infighting, young Ivan was left by the wayside. He would later write that he and his younger brother were treated little better than peasants. They often went hungry and had to wear old, shabby clothing. His childhood mistreatment gave Ivan a lifelong hatred of the Boyas, and when he came of age, they would come to regret ever crossing him. Finally, when he was 16 years old, Ivan donned Monomach's cap and took his place as the rightful ruler of Russia. From the very beginning, Ivan was determined to put more of a stamp on Russia than his father had. While Vasily was merely the Grand Prince of Moscow, Ivan had himself crowned as Tsar of all the Russias. His reign would see the Tsardom come to completely dominate Russian affairs, and the nation would tremble from the consequences. Ivan was now Tsar, but he needed a Tsaritsa. He sent out invitations to prominent noble families all across Russia. Send your eligible daughters to Moscow, and if you're really lucky, the Tsar might just select her to be his wife. Allegedly, up to 1,500 girls showed up at the Tsar's doorstep, but out of all of them, he chose just one. 2 weeks after his coronation, Ivan married Anastasia Romanovna, the first Tsaritsa. By all accounts, Ivan chose his wife well. Though he was a volatile personality from the beginning, Anastasia's seemed to have a calming effect on him. One writer even implied that the intelligent and driven Tsaritsa was the real power before the throne. But while Ivan and Anastasia seemed to genuinely care for one another, their marital bliss was quickly shattered by tragedy. Anastasia gave birth to 2 daughters in the early years of their marriage, but both of their young girls died in infancy. The couple was devastated, but they kept at it, and soon Anastasia bought Ivan a healthy son, Tsarevich Ivan Ivanovich. I can only imagine the young parents were absolutely obsessed with the boy's safety, because this time young Ivan managed to grow into a daring, intelligent young man. He accompanied his father to war, and once he even saved the Tsar's life. But one way or another, the news of Tsarevich was his father's son, and being Ivan the Terrible's kid was hazardous to your health. It would come much, much later. Ivan Ivanovich met the most brutal end of all, but that story comes later. Ivan suddenly grew extremely sick early in his reign. His condition quickly deteriorated, and it looked like another succession crisis was on the horizon. However, to everyone's shock, Ivan suddenly got better. But when the Bojas greeted the recovered Tsar, they found a whole new man in front of them, a man who was much more disturbed than he had once been. The new and not-so-improved Ivan was even more brash and impulsive than he'd been before, and this very quickly brought him to war. Desperate to gain access to the Baltic Sea and the important trade routes that come along with it, Ivan embarked on the Livonian War against Sweden and Lithuania and Poland and the Teutonic Knights. This war would last for decades and nearly bankrupt Russia, but Ivan was just getting started. The Livonian War was going badly. Droughts had led to widespread famine across the country, and Ivan still hadn't managed to get access to the Baltic Sea. It seemed like absolutely nothing was going his way, but just when it seemed like things couldn't get any worse, Ivan was hit with the most heartbreaking loss yet. Ivan's beloved wife Anastasia had been in poor health for years, but in 1560 she fell ill for the last time. She passed away that summer. To put it bluntly, her death left Ivan broken. His mental health had already been frayed from his own illness, but at least he had Anastasia around to keep him in check. With her gone, he had a complete emotional breakdown. Without his beloved wife to keep him contained, Ivan truly descended into tyranny. He forced the Bojas to grant him absolute power. He demanded that he be granted the ability to imprison traitors, execute them, and take all of their possessions for himself. And who decided who was traitor? Well, Ivan, of course. Ivan the Terrible now had more power than any Russian monarch had possessed before. But he was just getting started. One of his first decrees after returning was the creation of the Oprichnina. Soon, nearly every soul in Russia would learn to fear that name. The Oprichnina was a territory in Russia where Ivan had absolute control over every facet of life. But that wasn't nearly the worst part of the decree. To maintain order in this new world, Ivan created the Oprichniki. Ivan pulled men from every corner of Russian society and gave them everything they ever wanted. Money, power, you name it. This made the Oprichniki intensely devoted to the Tsar. It also ensured they didn't bat an eye when he began ordering them to commit some of the worst atrocities in Russian history. Ivan was still reeling from the death of his wife, and now he had a pack of rabid dogs to do his bidding for him. After Ivan's iron fist, Russia was becoming a frightening place, but his madness didn't stop there. In Ivan's time, Moscow was the most important city in Russia, but Novgorod was a close second. The city was still managing to prosper under Ivan's tyranny, and it became a favored haven of his critics. As you can imagine, Ivan wasn't too happy about that. The Tsar was becoming increasingly paranoid and started seeing conspiracies everywhere. Eventually, his focus landed on Novgorod, and what followed was by far the darkest saga of his rule. First, Ivan had thousands of people exiled from the city of Novgorod, in the hopes that it might help quell any potential rebellion. When his paranoia didn't subsist, he started executing anyone from the city who he deemed to be a threat. Hundreds of boyars met their fate around this time. Nobody was safe from Ivan the Terrible. Ivan's next act was something completely unprecedented and absolutely insane. The Tsar of Russia launched a military attack on one of his own cities, and this wasn't just any ordinary army. He sent the Oprichniki to teach Novgorod a lesson. One historian described what happened next as the most repulsive episode in the brutal history of the Oprichnina. The cruel, senseless slaughter of innocent people made Oprichnina synonymous with lawlessness and excess. To defend his horrific actions, Ivan claimed that Novgorod planned to defect from Russia and join nearby Poland, Lithuania. Of course, there's absolutely no concrete evidence to back up his claim, but that wasn't about to stop him. In the summer of 1569, Ivan pointed the Oprichniki towards Novgorod. They left a path of destruction in their wake, terrorizing every village they came across. In each of the villages that Ivan's army passed through, he had all the prominent merchants and officials rounded up, seeking proof that Novgorod was planning to defect. He had these men put to the question, and his methods were horrifying. Classes were subjugated to a horrific fire-making device known only as a grill. Ivan didn't find the proof he wanted, but he'd come too far to let that stop him. Finally, they made it to the city, and that's when the true nightmare began. The different classes of Novgorod all met different fates in the massacre, but all of them were equally horrible. Those of the church were rounded up, subjected to horrific interrogation methods, and either thrown in prison or executed outright. The nobles who were left saw the brunt of Ivan's wrath. Their homes were burned, their possessions were taken, and they were executed en masse. Ivan's main beef was with the church and the nobility, so for the most part, his men didn't attack the city's working classes outright. But in a way, they met the darkest fate of all. When they tired of killing, the Oprichniki started letting the brutal Russian winter do their dirty work. Men, women, and children were all indiscriminately tied up and thrown into the Volkhov River. Ivan took out his rage on Novgorod for 5 horrific weeks. Ivan was laid dead when he finally left, and the city would feel the effects of the massacre for generations. Not only was the population decimated, but Ivan also laid waste to the farmland surrounding the city. The region was already suffering from a famine, but this ensured that the populace wouldn't recover for years. Yet the ramifications of the attack went even deeper than that. The remaining citizens had to grapple with the psychological trauma from the fact that they were attacked by their own ruler. It was a blow from which the city never truly recovered, and Novgorod never again rivaled Moscow in influence. The massacre of Novgorod was the darkest moment in the history of the Oprichnina, but it also marked the beginning of its end. At first, the atrocity was a stain on Ivan's reputation. Also, when Ivan sent his Oprichniki into battle against the Crimean army not long after, they were utterly humiliated. It turns out fighting real soldiers is different than attacking helpless citizens. Just 3 years after the massacre, Ivan ended the Oprichnina and disbanded the Oprichniki. Even the Terrible did a lot of horrible things, but the death of his son Ivan was the darkest moment of them all. It all began when the devoted son started to admit that his father wasn't exactly doing a great job. The Livonian War was still going on at this point, and it was going no better than it had for the last 20 years. The Tsarevich decided to take matters into his own hands and demanded Ivan give him troops so that he could liberate the besieged city of Pskov. For his part, Ivan couldn't care less about Pskov, and he began to resent his son's rebelliousness. Things were tense already, but then, in one chilling outburst, Ivan the Terrible finally went too far. On November 15, 1581, Ivan the Terrible was in a particular violent mood. When he saw his pregnant daughter-in-law walking around in clothing that he didn't approve of, for whatever reason, he absolutely snapped. He viciously attacked her, and her screams brought the Tsarevich running to see what was happening. Ivan managed to pull the father off his wife, but the violence was just getting started. Tragically, after Ivan attacked his daughter-in-law, she suffered a miscarriage. In the struggle, the younger Ivan screamed at his father, "You sent my first wife to a convent for no reason. You did the same with the second, and now you strike the third, causing the death of the son she holds in her womb." The relationship between father and son had finally been irreparably damaged, but either way, it wouldn't last much longer. As the younger Ivan screamed at his father, the elder Ivan changed the subject to his son's recent insubordination related to the siege of Pskov. The Tsar accused his son of rebellion and treason. It was completely ludicrous, as per usual, but this time the younger Ivan stood up to his father. He denied the accusations, but stood firm that the people of Pskov deserved to be liberated. He had a point, but Ivan the Terrible was beyond reason by now. Mad with rage, Ivan finally snapped. He grabbed his royal scepter and smashed it into his son's temple. One of his advisors, who was witnessing the fight, ran to stop him, but Ivan struck him as well. The Tsarevich fell to the ground, blood pouring from his head. The sight of his own son and heir lying bleeding on the ground finally snapped Ivan back to reality. He threw himself on top of his boy, sobbing, kissing his face, and crying, "I've killed my son. I've killed my son." Allegedly, Ivan Ivanovich regained consciousness just long enough to look up at his father and say, "I die as a devoted son and most humble servant." He quickly fell back into a coma, where he stayed for the next several days. Distraught, the Tsar desperately prayed for a miracle, but nothing was coming. After 4 days, Ivan Ivanovich died. Ivan the Terrible's legacy is absolutely horrific, but killing his own son is the darkest stain of all. After his horrific reign, one would think that Ivan the Terrible would have been assassinated or perhaps killed in some misguided military venture, but no. Ivan the Terrible died of a stroke while playing a game of chess. Such a simple way for such a monstrous man to die. Soviet scientists excavated Ivan the Terrible's grave in 1963. His bones painted a grim picture of his final days. At the time of his death, the Tsar suffered from several debilitating bone diseases that would have left him in constant pain and barely able to move. They also found high levels of mercury in his blood. Only from ointments he would have taken to try and ease his agonizing joints. Ivan the Terrible was the definition of a tyrant. He helped create the idea that the Tsar was an absolute power accountable to no one but God. Someone who could essentially do whatever he wanted with zero repercussions. It was this attitude that eventually made the Russian people so fed up that the Soviets were able to topple the monarchy and take control. How ironic, then, that the communist regime then spun Ivan's legacy to make him a symbol of nationalist pride. Specifically, Joseph Stalin identified himself with Ivan. In hindsight, that actually makes a lot of sense. Ivan the Terrible is actually an indirect translation of his Russian sobriquet, Ivan Grozny. At the time, Grozny would have meant something closer to powerful or formidable, a man to be feared and respected, but not a man who's considered evil or monstrous. In fact, one historian claims that the name Grozny would have meant magnificent or courageous. But whether or not they meant it that way, now that we can look back upon Ivan's reign,